Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this event. Sorry, Tim, I'm dropping your book. My name's Morag Sheikh. I'm the Vice Principal for Humanities and Social Sciences here at Queen Mary. And as I'm sure you're aware, this evening we are celebrating the launch of Tim Bale's wonderful new book, of which I have a copy. And I think there will be copies for everyone to purchase later. That's right, isn't it, Tim? Don't be too modest, Tim. Now, this book launch is being hosted by the Mile End Institute, and I'm delighted to be chair of the advisory board of the Mile End Institute, and I know many of you will have been at the launch of that recently. And this is the second in the programme of public events, which draws together a series of core concerns of the Institute, bringing Queen Mary's research in public politics, in political history, British politics, to bear upon the public understanding of some big issues that are facing us all at the moment. So we began with an event that talked about the British Constitution and the kinds of changes to that we might see over the coming years. And now this evening we're talking about models of leadership and how the Labour Party has been functioning and how it might continue to function under Ed Miliband. So the context for this evening's discussion is, I guess, the election, which some of you may be quite interested in. This book is going to help us all to navigate just thinking through the weeks ahead and be some kind of guide to what the next Prime Minister might be and how he would behave in that role. The Mile End Institute is also hosting an election blog, and I do encourage you all to get onto that. Mike, how do people find out? Do they just go to the Mile End Institute website? Click on the blog, okay. Because many academic experts from Queen Mary are contributing and will be offering insights and analysis over the coming weeks, so I do encourage you to do that. This evening we are delighted to welcome our two panellists. Andrew Rawnsley, distinguished columnist for The Observer, and of course a very well-known chronicler of the new Labour government, and Tim Bale, who, as well as being the author of the book, is also a professor in our School of Politics and IR, and one of the most respected and best-known commentators on contemporary British politics. In terms of how the evening will go, in a moment I will hand over to Andrew, who's going to interview Tim about his particular take and analysis of Miliband and the Labour Party since 2010, and I think that will last for about 30 minutes, after which there will be an opportunity for some questions from the audience. We would like to be quite inclusive in the questions, so if we can encourage you to think about what you might like... Oh, I've just lost it. You still here? Yep. To think about what you'd like to ask, and have a really succinct and focused question. That would be really helpful. And after that, there'll be a reception in the foyer, so there'll be opportunities for informal discussion, and you're all very, very welcome to join us there. And Tim, I think, will be signing copies of his book, should you wish to buy one. And we would like to acknowledge our thanks to Oxford University Press for sponsoring the reception. Finally, please can I encourage you to keep checking the website of the Mile End Institute, sign up so that you receive automatic notification of our events. And the most immediate event after this one is on the 31st of March, where we're hosting a major public roundtable on the question, are women's rights human rights? And to which you're all warmly invited. So now it's my pleasure to hand over to Andrew and to Tim.
Thank you. Good evening. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here talking to Tim Bale about his new book, 5-Year Mission. Very good value for an unsigned copy at $10.99 or a signed copy at $5.99, whichever you prefer. I'm joking, Tim. And we'll all know in a matter of, less than 7 weeks now, whether Ed Miliband's mission did prove to be mission successful or mission impossible. The moment of truth is coming up. Tim, I think we should begin about 5 years ago and just, if you like, assess the scale of the task that faced Ed Miliband, because Labour had just gone down to its second worst defeat since World War I, only just better in terms of vote share than Michael Foot's suicide election in 1983, although it was slightly flattered because the electoral system meant they had still quite a substantial number of MPs. Do you think when he took on this task, Ed Miliband appreciated the scale of what he got to do?
Yeah, I think he did. I mean, no thinking Labour politician could look at the result that the party had in 2010 and think that it was going to be anything other than an uphill task. As you say, I mean, the party polled under 30%. It wasn't necessarily just saved, I think, however, by the electoral system. It was also actually a fairly good effort on the ground by a lot of Labour constituency workers and indeed the trade unions as well. And of course, they're very important in Miliband's victory. So I think there was a sense in which, although they were beaten badly, there was nevertheless a degree of confidence that it may be possible to get back after 5 years simply because David Cameron didn't manage to win. I think there are very good reasons why David Cameron didn't manage to pull off a victory. It would have been quite incredible in some ways if he had have won an overall majority. But I think the fact that he didn't, given the fact that Gordon Brown himself was so unpopular, given the state of the economy, made quite a few Labour people think that actually this wasn't, although an uphill task, an impossible task. And I think Ed Miliband was one of those. And one thing that I don't need to tell you about Ed Miliband is that he's really very good on the numbers. This is someone who really does understand numbers, actually. Maybe not quite as well as Margaret Thatcher. That was always her great skill. But I think he looked at the terrain and thought, this is a job that I can do and that the Labour Party can do. It's doable, exactly.
Now, he got the leadership with virtually no nominations from fellow members of the Shadow Cabinet. And after the transfer of preferences, and if only his brother had managed to charm 6 more MPs, David Miliband rather than Ed would be now leading the Labour Party into this general election in May. How big a problem for him and his leadership was it that actually none of his senior colleagues had wanted him to be leader?
I mean, it's never going to be easy for anybody who becomes leader of a party because they are almost certainly guaranteed to have stood against and won against people who are then going to have to work alongside them and just underneath them. I mean, Margaret Thatcher had perhaps almost a more serious problem than Miliband did in that respect. I think in some ways the fact that he lost out to his brother while clearly being personally very, very difficult and clearly being something that was a difficult sell both to voters and the media, actually in some ways, ironically, meant he was safer than perhaps he might otherwise have been because it wasn't, I think, an option for David Miliband to kind of lurk on the back benches and then strike exactly when Ed Miliband proved that, as far as some people were concerned, much as he may have liked to, I'll leave that to you. Somebody who wasn't Miliband's brother, somebody who wasn't in that situation, I think might have retired hurt back to the back benches and just waited his time, and then say 2011, 2012, when it looked like Ed Miliband wasn't doing it, might have struck. So he didn't have to worry about that. I think the fact also that Ed Balls actually entered the contest and lost, came quite a poor third.
Badly.
Yes,
yeah.
I think that has had something to do with the fact that we haven't seen, although the two don't necessarily get on famously, we haven't seen a kind of Blair-Brown type rivalry because unlike Gordon Brown, Ed Balls could never say, I gifted you the leadership, now you owe me something. It's clear that, whatever his strengths or his weaknesses, Ed Miliband certainly had the beating of Ed Balls.
Yeah. Now, a good point in this Parliament for Labour is the 2012 omni-shambles budget, when, if you remember, George Osborne thinks it's a brilliant idea when the country's still in the grip of austerity to cut income tax rates for the very highest earners whilst slapping new taxes on things like hot pasties. I remember him and Cameron then trying to show that they weren't pasty-phobic or against pasty eaters. I think David Cameron claimed to have eaten a pasty recently on Leeds railway station, only for it to be discovered there wasn't an emporium selling pasties on Leeds railway station, so he'd made that up or forgotten where he'd clamped his lips around one of those comestibles. Anyway, at that point, the Tories had been just about ahead of Labour for most of the Parliament up to that point, and then there's a decisive break in the polls, and they fall behind and they stay behind. Good for Ed Miliband, but I know there are some people in the Labour Party and some people in the commentating trade who think actually that was an opportunity missed because then it induced a certain complacency about how much Labour needed to do to make itself electable. Do you think that's right, or do you read that differently?
Well, I think it's possibly true because a big gap did open up, and I think politicians are inclined always to see good news as being down to them rather than the failings of their opponents necessarily. I think that's a kind of a temperamental trait that most politicians have in some sense. They've got let's say, an inflated sense of their own agency, put it that way. I also think actually that omnishambles budget paradoxically was what saved Ed Miliband, because I think if you're thinking about leadership contests, there's only actually a very small window of opportunity in a parliament, and that window of opportunity occurs when the person in the leadership doesn't quite look like they're delivering, doesn't look like they're going to do it, but it's not so far into the parliament, so near to the next election that it looks desperate if you're going to replace them. So actually, if there was a window where Ed Miliband would have been in trouble, it would have been around the end of 2011, sometime mid-2012. But by doing that on the shambles budget, as you quite rightly say, George Osborne closed that window. And in some senses, he saved Ed Miliband, I think. He would have been in more serious trouble, I think. I mean, it's, 2 years in, he's not making any impact. That's a problem.
Although, of course, I mean, the Labour Party the Tory Party sort of dictatorship punctuated by regicide, but the Labour Party, however bad its leader has been, or however badly they've been performing, historically doesn't move against its leaders. They didn't sack Michael Foot, even though he was clearly leading them to defeat, or Gordon Brown. So once you've got the job, you're probably safe for a term.
Well, I think there is something cultural in that. I agree, and it might go right back to kind of trade union roots of the Labour Party, and you get in behind the leader.
And the mechanism is very difficult.
Yes, absolutely. It's very difficult to do, and that's partly actually the point about this window of opportunity, because in the Labour Party, it's such a long process. And you have to do it at a particular time of year that it would be very difficult to do it apart from in that, as I say, sort of 6-month window of opportunity. So I think there is something in that cultural explanation. Having said that, if you look at how bad Ed Miliband's numbers were in terms of his personal poll ratings, and there was no sense in which he was growing on the electorate. Things were getting worse. And you look at the fact that, as you say, the Conservatives were still ahead despite austerity, then, I think this is a leader who could have been in trouble, actually. And there were enough people in there, going back to your earlier point, leaving aside Ed Balls perhaps, even some of the others who lost even more badly than Ed Balls. I can think of one person who would have thought that he could do a better job and may still think that he could do a better job than Ed Miliband.
My experience, there's 625 members of the House of Commons who think they could do better than job than whoever is their leader at the time. Now, the Tories and their press have tried to paint him as Red Ed. That's been one of their claims. It's never quite stuck, but maybe it's stuck a bit in the minds of some voters. Then you can meet other people in the Labour Party who lament he hasn't been quite radical enough, and they say they source Labour's failure to make a decisive breakthrough in the polls to that, and they say, why can't he just commit to renationalising the railways, for instance, which the polling anyway says is very, very popular with most of the public. I mean, in your estimation, how radical is, if you compare him with other Labour leaders, so that's a good way of doing it, how radical, how to the left is Ed Miliband?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not so sure he's actually that much to the left. I do think he's quite radical in the sense that he, rather ambitiously, I think, thinks that the solution in some ways for Britain is to look more like Germany and to actually shift this country's political economy from a kind of Anglo-Saxon style, lean and mean, hire and fire capitalism towards a more managed sort of hybrid, almost Christian democratic in some ways capitalism that we see in Germany and some of the Benelux countries. So I mean, I think to the extent that he wants radical change, he's quite radical, and I think that's a very, very big project, and I'm not even sure it's realisable. Whether that's left wing is another matter. I mean, I'm sure he is someone who thinks that the state has a role. And has a much bigger regulatory role anyway than we see at the moment. I think he is perhaps less of a Keynesian than Ed Balls, but sees the state as having a role in sort of pump priming when it comes to the economy. And I think, he does believe in a lot of the stuff about devolution and in terms of changing the banking sector as well. And I think there is perhaps a residual thing that people do pick up, that he's uncomfortable or at least unfamiliar with business. I mean, this is often said about him, and I think it's true. You hear it too often. That he's not someone who's actually kind of comfortable or familiar with that milieu at all. He's not like Tony Blair, who could, go to these kind of
some
events
people would say he rather overdid it.
Well, perhaps, yes, and perhaps indeed Ed Balls even overdid it, perhaps when, he was working at the Treasury.
Well, you'll remember, some of you may remember, which was his first really proper party conference speech, the Predators versus Producers one, which was a bit mocked at the time. I didn't particularly mock it. I mean, we actually always have, even Conservatives can distinguish between productive forms of capitalism that employ lots of people, invent new things, satisfy their consumers, and predatory forms of capitalism. But then he ran into trouble because he couldn't list many examples of one or the other. I sort of agree with you, maybe if he'd wanted to reassure the business community more, he should have balanced attacks on the rapacious elements of capitalism with praise for the entrepreneurial and inventive bits. Was that a sign he hadn't really thought things through properly? That he had that nice phrase, but then it failed to be filled out properly afterwards?
I think so, and it's also, I think, evidence of the fact that there is sometimes a disconnect between Ed's office and people working in shadow teams, because that clearly was you say, underprepared. You should have had examples ready to go. It was an obvious question that you were going to be asked.
Mr. Miliband, give me 10 Predators.
Absolutely, and it also says something about his media operation, which, for all it has its strengths, some people have made serious criticisms about. I mean, it is odd that two very experienced journalists didn't look at this and say, this is the first question you're going to be asked, Ed. You're going to need to come out with that. Now, either they said that and they were ignored, which is possible because Ed Miliband is someone who does know his own mind and sometimes will kind of ignore advice in that sense, or they weren't doing their job properly, and that's quite worrying.
Now, there are some people saying, they've said this for quite a long time actually, that his office is basically dysfunctional. Was that your finding when you were researching the book?
I think what you do find is a lot of people prepared to say that it's dysfunctional. Quite how dysfunctional it is in its operation, I don't think it's quite as bad as people think. I think there's a perennial problem. You know this. I mean, people outside of the leaders' circle will always say it's the king's advisors.
Yeah. The same. Those who haven't got the golden swipe card to David Cameron's in the circle say, funnily enough, exactly the same thing.
Yes, exactly. However, I mean, I think as that example showed, there are concerns. Particularly about sort of the messaging and the media stuff, actually. And we've seen those again, you see that repeated again and again. You might remember there was a poster talking about Conservative plans to put VAT or what the Conservatives had done to put VAT on certain food items. And there was a shopping basket, and it turned out that only kind of 3 of the 10 items actually were vatable and that kind of thing. And that's just kind of unprofessional and rather, in some senses, surprising, given how New Labour, as you well know, became a byword for professionalism, for tying down every last thing and getting it right most of the time.
You mentioned New Labour, and it strikes me one of the most important strategic decisions Ed Miliband made was either explicitly or implicitly to repudiate New Labour. And you sort of understood he was obviously going to want to distance himself from things about the last Labour government's record and Tony Blair's record that were unpopular, like the Iraq War, for instance. That was understandable. Was it, though, a mistake to almost suggest the whole of the New Labour period, even though Labour's longest period in office ever, by a long way, was a mistake? Because it meant that then, with things that New Labour did that were very popular with the public, like what it spent on the NHS or how it improved schools, he couldn't claim them then as Labour achievements, having said or implied, Tony Blair, what an embarrassment, let's forget it ever happened. Do you agree with me that he may have overdone that?
I think you're absolutely right. And I think actually it wasn't just him, to be honest. If you look at the Labour leadership contest, you'll see that even David Miliband was very concerned not to be seen as too close to the kind of Blair era, and obviously Tony Blair himself. And you'll remember that Peter Mandelson came out for David Miliband. That didn't have Ed's people kind of punching the air, but it did have some people on David Miliband's side thinking, oh no, it's Peter Mandelson, because of the electorate that they were facing, Labour Party members, trade unionists, etc. So actually all of them indulged in a bit of kind of implicit distancing and sometimes quite explicit distancing from the New Labour era. And I think that has been a problem because it has contributed to the way that the Conservatives have been able to paint that kind of 1997 to 2010 period as a period of sort of lax spending, which didn't actually deliver anything. When, if you talk to Labour MPs, and this is something that Blairite MPs are incredibly annoyed about, they will say, look at the Sure Start centres in my constituency, look at the school building, look at the hospital, look at, and so much changed during that time in terms of, the improvement in kind of basic health and education infrastructure. And yet that seems to have been forgotten. And I think that has been a really, really serious problem. But I think that goes into a wider issue about what to make of that 97 to 2010 period and what to defend and what to try and leave behind. I mean, and the biggest problem, of course, has been the deficit, So you've had Labour politicians like Ed Balls, in some ways quite understandably, if you look at the figures, say, I'm not going to apologise for the deficit situation we were in. I'm not going to apologise for the debt. That was bailing out the banks. The deficit was Keynesian stabilisers coming in. We've nothing to apologise for. And yet, of course, the public continue to think, helped by the Conservatives, that actually Labour did overspend and has something to apologise for.
Despite the fact the Tories actually signed up to all those Labour spending.
Temporarily, as they would say.
But when they were intellectually on the defensive.
Absolutely. So, I mean, it's been a real problem, I think, for the Miliband project, or the Labour Party at least anyway, since 2010, to rescue some very, important achievements.
Well, this was a dilemma, and we do know, actually, because it got leaked, what David Miliband would have said.
Yeah.
And he would have apologised much more to say, we did spend too much, we've learnt our lesson. There are other people who make the point, and I sort of take it, maybe people around Ed Miliband and Ed Balls make the point, how attractive would it be as a Labour slogan, we fucked up last time, elect us again? And you see their argument.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. I mean, so there's no easy answer. I mean, I mean, there was a column by Janan Ganesh, I think, the weekend in the FT, and, excellent columnist, but did this kind of counterfactual. If David Miliband had won, Labour would have apologised, it would have all gone much more smoothly, and by now they'd have had credibility and go on into the election with less to worry about. I'm just not so sure about that. I think it's very, very difficult, actually, that dilemma. I think, however, personally, from my point of view, I think they should have taken the advice of Philip Gould, which is always concede and move on, which is, even if you've lost the argument, but you don't think you should have lost the argument, you've still lost the argument, and there's no point in trying to replay it.
You can rewind the tape of the 2010 election every time you like, and Labour still loses.
And Labour still loses. And I think maybe one of the problems that Ed Balls has, some people would say, and I might share that criticism, is that he is very concerned not to lose the intellectual argument almost. As well as the ideological argument, very concerned not to sell the past, when actually it might have been better, as I say, to concede and move on in some senses. And it was odd that a government during boom times was still running a deficit. I mean, let's face it, it wasn't huge and it wasn't problematic, but it was odd that happened.
Yes, I can explain that, but that's a subject for... No, I think I can, why they did that, for another day. Looking across the sort of nearly 5 years of his leadership of the Labour Party, when you researched it for your book, in what respects, did you find respects in which he's changed, either in his political complexion or in his personality and the way he approaches the job?
Actually, not that much, I think. I think Ed Miliband, as I said before, is someone who... he's expressed it, hasn't he, as being intellectually self-confident, or more intellectually self-confident than David Cameron. I think this is someone who actually has an analysis, is fairly convinced that that analysis is right and that he will be proved right in the end. I think he's had to change in some respects, and the most obvious one has been, if you remember, straight after becoming leader, he made a great play of not getting into kind of photo opportunities and gimmicks. He wasn't going to use his family in anything.
No huskies.
No huskies, exactly. And he really has had to do something about that. You know, we saw sort of about a year or two later after that, you know, a kind of spread in the Mirror over a couple of pages, Christmas with the Milibands, you know. And
we've recently had his 2 kitchens.
And we've recently had exactly, and
yeah.
it's led him into trouble, and in some senses, perhaps it's kind of it's proof that he shouldn't have tried all that. The bacon sandwich is the other obvious one, but that's where he's really had to change. So I think he would have liked to do politics differently in what he would regard as a more kind of grown-up way. But that's simply not the way that politics is done in this kind of 24/7 more presidential era, and he's had to accept that. And I think one of the problems has been that it's been grudging, and he's not been proactive. So that he's obviously uncomfortable with it. He's obviously not particularly good at it, and he's then tried to make a virtue of not being good at it,
yes.
which hasn't worked either. You know, so it's kind of gone all postmodern and backfired on him big time. Yeah.
Because he made that speech. When was it? Last summer, when he said, you know, if you want the guy with the Hollywood looks or whatever, is paraphrasing, vote for the other guy. Not for me. It was about images really dreadful, and we should concentrate on substance. And I rang up one of his people after and said, well, are you telling me now he will do no more photo opportunities ever? He said, no, we'll still do photo opportunities, Andrew, but they'll be deliberately crap. He was joking.
Speaking of which, of course, he then went off to see President Obama and had that terribly crap photo opportunity, if you remember. So
let's hone in on one of the crunchy questions this election. I mean, it is a problem for Labour in a fairly presidential politics that his personal ratings are very poor. And David Cameron easily beats him on the preferred Prime Minister question when you ask voters. Now, one can have a view on whether this is fair or not, but there it is. What's your explanation for why, and 5 years, nearly 5 years, quite a long time, that he has convinced so few people, including actually a lot of voters who say they're Labour, that he is up to being Prime Minister, that for so many people at the moment, he still fails what I sometimes call the blink test. People can't shut their eyes and imagine him outside number 10. Why hasn't he conquered that problem?
I mean, I think, unfortunately, it has a lot to do simply with his appearance. And I know that sounds incredibly...
You're a professor.
Yeah, I know. It sounds incredibly superficial, but I do think that has something to do with it. It does have to do with his voice as well. You know, there's no doubting that's the case. It does have to do, I think, with the contrast with his brother, and that's problematic, I think. I think his brother was always seen as the kind of more charismatic, effective one, rightly or wrongly, and in not being David Miliband, that's one of his problems as well. So I think it's that. I think it's also, to be honest, I think a problem of definition. It's partly because Ed Miliband, I think, has been very concerned to keep the Labour Party as united as possible. And that has meant that he's not gone on a kind of David Cameron or Tony Blair exercise, you know, more thorough in Blair's case and more superficial in Cameron's case, to sort of take on his party and show them who's boss and in that way gain some kind of kudos from the electorate. Funnily enough, he's actually been backed into a corner and has had to do that and got no credit for it. So, for example, on the trade union reform, I mean, any other leader, had they planned to do that and you know, strategically made that move, probably would have got some credit for it. But
funnily enough, he went further than Tony Blair ever did.
Absolutely, and Blair himself said that.
Come in those reforms. But he seemed to make a conscious decision, maybe it was part of the deal with the unions, that he wouldn't dramatise it, because they actually, having huffed and puffed, retreated. And then there was this sort of North Korean People's Assembly style vote where it all sort of swept through by a massive majority.
Well, I think it was only 83%.
But he didn't get a great deal of credit for that. No. And this is it seems to me one of the dilemmas or conundrums about his leadership. On the one hand, you have to give him credit for this. Every other time in post-war history, that Labour went into opposition. They decided to have a civil
Yeah.
war. They did in the 1950s, they did in the 1980s. And meanwhile, the Tories said, well, thank you very much. We'll govern the country whilst you go around killing each other. Now, one of the things that has not happened this time, there has been not an ideological civil war. There have been some arguments, but there's been no blood on the carpet. There's those people who say, well, that's a great plus. There's other people who say this is the unity of fudge, or as you were hinting at, it's only unity because you never really had the arguments out. Do you think there's something in that?
Well, I think there's some truth to that. I think there are other reasons for that unity. I think one, and it comes back to your first question, is that there are still enough people on the Labour front bench, even those who aren't admirers of Miliband, who think that they've got a chance of winning. And actually, I don't think that was the case in the 50s, and it wasn't in the 80s, actually. And I think that sense that they might have a chance has held people into the project such as it is. I think also that Ed Miliband, for all his faults, is actually a kind of emotionally intelligent politician. I mean, you know, relatively speaking, anyway, for a politician, is actually quite good at managing people and does listen to people. Doesn't always hear what they're saying in some senses, but he does allow people to talk, and he does allow people to think at least that they've had some influence on him, and that's been important.
So if I can come into some people say he overdoes it, and you know, you do have members of the Labour front bench who say, you know, the leader's office, it goes back to what you were saying earlier, it's like a black hole. You put a proposal in and then nothing ever comes out again because there's too much consultation. It's sort of analysis to paralysis.
Yes, I think there is something to that. And I think also one of the things that Ed Miliband does, and it's a criticism that, you know, several people make, is that he tends, when it comes to his appointments, to appoint two different type of people. So he'll have your kind of blue skies, interesting thinkers like John Cruddas or, you know, Stuart Wood or people like that around him who'll do this kind of big picture stuff. And that's all quite radical and quite exciting. But then he'll also appoint to his staff kind of, you know, ex-Treasury people like Tim Bale, for example, or, you know, some of the people kind of running his campaign who are much more cautious, much more kind of old style, not machine type, but anyway, less like the Cruddas and the Woods, if you like. And he allows those to kind of cancel each other out, and then nothing actually ever quite gets done. So there's no direction set. Or the other problem is that he ends up kind of talking a big game and then not actually delivering on it, which a lot of people on the left would say, you know, is happening with the manifesto. So in other words, you know, he has the IPPR, for example, do this fantastic Condition of Britain report. You know, it's going to kind of change the way that social democracy is done in this country for a generation. And then when it's launched, the only kind of top line that the Labour Party decided to pull out of it is something on, you know, withdrawing benefits from the under-21s or something, you know. So, I mean, he can be guilty of, I think, sometimes kind of willing the ends without willing the means, really. And that is a problem because it doesn't inspire people, really.
Now the financial crash and what has followed it has posed big problems for traditional parties of left and right across Europe. They're all suffering. I mean, if you look on average, the combined vote of the usual or traditional governing centre-right and centre-left party across Europe has dropped on average by about 10%. And I suppose the big question for social democrats is, what does social democracy mean when there's no money? And it was a big question facing him. Do you think he satisfactorily answered that question during his time as leader?
Probably not, because I don't think Labour has been prepared, at least publicly, to acknowledge the extent to which there is no money and the extent to which even the Labour government, if there is one, is going to have to make cuts. So while, I mean, there's a sort of general feeling that austerity will have to continue in some ways, if you look at what Labour is about in terms of its messaging, it's still about, you know, Labour investment versus Tory cuts, to use a Gordon Brown phrase. I don't think they've actually moved on that much, at least in terms of the way that they kind of message to the public in that sense. Now, underneath, I think, there's perhaps more sense that things have got to change. And I think this is where the devolution comes in. I think there is a sense that it may be possible to do things differently by allowing local government its head in ways that actually it's proved it's capable of doing since 2010. I mean, one of the kind of stories really about the 2010 to 2015 Parliament is how much austerity there's been, particularly at a local government level, and yet how little most people have noticed it anyway. I mean, clearly there will be people in the audience who can say, in my constituency, this Sure Start Centre is gone, or, there's pressure on social care, etc., etc. But we really haven't had the kind of degree of shroud waving, if you want to put it cynically, that you might have expected, actually, from a lot of Labour local government people. They've actually just got their heads down and managed it. And in some ways, I think that has encouraged some people at the top of the Labour Party to think, actually, this is in some ways doable, that we could cope and we could do things differently. But actually, that's not going to come from the top. That's going to come from actually looking at experiments on the ground and coming bottom up at that. And they have got some people, after all, in Parliament who could tell them a lot about that, because they've got local government experience. People like Steve Reed,
Sure. Okay, let's have some questions from the audience. The only thing I say to you, the more the merrier, is it's best if you ask a question rather than make a speech. So, who would like to ask a question? Yeah, we've got that chap here. Where's with the red tie?
Hi there, it's Tim Smith. I actually work for the Conservative Party. I was wondering to what extent you think the relationship between Ed Miliband and Ed Balls has evolved during the experience of opposition. I don't know if you saw, but we had a campaign video about the fantastic documentary, which I recommend everyone watches, We Are the Treasury, where you get to see, the Ed Balls swagger and Ed Miliband, the sort of slightly nerdy character in the corner. And it would be interesting to know, from your research, how far Ed Miliband has grown into the role of the leader, even in that individual relationship.
Right. Do you want me to take them individually?
Yeah, no, let's deal with that one.
Okay. I think the relationship between the two has always been awkward, in the sense that I think Ed Balls feels, maybe understandably, that Ed Miliband was his junior at the Treasury. And I think it's actually quite hard for people around Ed Balls, and maybe even Ed Balls himself, to accept in some ways that, despite the fact that he was beaten by Ed Miliband in the leadership contest, that that isn't still, in some ways, the natural order of things, and that, particularly sort of intellectually, perhaps, Ed Balls would feel that he was the better man. Having said that, however, I don't necessarily get the sense that Ed Miliband is sort of cowering while Ed Balls bangs the table and actually sort of dictates policy. I think it is interesting that Ed Balls, and of course we forget this, wasn't his first choice for Shadow Chancellor. In the end, or actually quite near the beginning of the time, because Alan Johnson resigned, he had to make him Shadow Chancellor. And I think that clearly must have had something to do with the fact that he didn't necessarily feel it was going to be an easy relationship, and he couldn't have complete control of economic policy in the way that he may have done with, if you like, a weaker Chancellor. I don't think the relationship between the two, however, is totally dysfunctional in the way that perhaps the Conservative Party would like to portray it. But it's not an easy one. And then, of course, it does beg the question about what happens if Labour wins, because most people assume that Ed Balls will be Chancellor. I think I would guess he would be Chancellor, but we can't know that for sure. It's not absolutely, definitely the case that he will be. And I suppose if you were looking for a Prime Minister to kind of assert his authority, that might be something he might do in coming in. Whether he'd do that in a minority government, I very much doubt.
Okay, we have another question, please. The lady here.
I'm Donitza Kirk. I work for the Associated Press. The problem of Scotland, I just wonder what your impression is about how he is going to attack that, and how badly damaged was he by the referendum and that whole campaign?
Well, I certainly think he was wrong-footed by David Cameron, as was the whole of the Labour Party, and that was actually unforgivable, I think. It was quite clear, I think, if you looked at the newspapers, in the 3 or 4 days leading up to the referendum result, that the Conservatives, might play it the way they did, and there was no kind of wargaming around what Labour should do in that eventuality. It's interesting, I remember doing some research for the book and talking to someone who said, we realised a year out that this might happen, they could do this, and we kept saying, we've got to have a discussion about this, we've got to have it, and of course, it never happened. And then Labour were in a complete mess that morning, if you remember.
Friday.
Absolutely,
Oh,
yes.
well, I agree. I spoke to them that morning, and a lot of them were genuinely surprised. I hope our friend from the Conservative Party forgives me for observing. I think they and the Lib Dems made the foolish assumption David Cameron would act the statesman when the Union had just been saved, rather than go for narrow party political advantage that might destroy the Union that he claims to care about. But there we are.
Yeah, I couldn't possibly comment on that. I think then, from then on, Scotland has been, a neuralgic nightmare, really, for the Labour Party. I don't think anyone anticipated the boost it would give to the SNP. I mean, I think people thought it would give the SNP a bit of a blip, and they would probably win some seats off Labour, but no one anticipated what looks like is going to happen.
Although with hindsight, it makes complete sense.
Yeah.
But the yes voters, because it was narrow, still G'd up and assemble behind the SNP. No voters fragment again. And also quite a chunk of those no voters were sort of reluctant no. In their heart they were yes, but their head said this is economically too risky. But that doesn't make you feel great about voting no the day after, does it?
No, it doesn't. And I mean, it's flowed not into just voting support for the SNP, but the other problem is it's flowed into membership for the SNP. So Labour could have hoped, perhaps, to rely on its machine that's always been there, although it might be a bit of a rusty machine, it's still a machine, to kind of see it through. And I just don't think that's going to happen. I think the problem for the Labour Party, of course, is that inevitably it's going to try and fight a kind of rearguard action and hope that it can win at least some seats, maybe 15, 20 if it's lucky, perhaps from the SNP, and that might, I think, displace some activity that should be going on in England and Wales. Having said that, of course, the Scottish Party is quite separate from the English Party, so it's not. There's no sense in which perhaps the Labour Party could take a decision at a UK level to kind of leave Scotland and and forget about it and just concentrate on England and Wales and concentrate resources in that way. But it's a very interesting one for Douglas Alexander because he's obviously got his seat to defend. Is he going to bother doing that? He's supposed to be in charge or joint charge in some ways of Labour's campaign. So is he going to do a Chris Patten from 1992? If you remember, the Tory party chairman there lost his seat in Bath, but was thanked for it because he ran a very, very effective campaign from the centre.
Okay, let's have another question now. We've had a question from somebody who works for a political party and one from a member of the media. So I quite like the next one to be from a student. Have we got a? Yeah. Are you a genuine student? Yes?
Get your NUS card out.
Yes.
That's right.
The gentleman in the white shirt and the spectacles there, please. Yeah, wave your hand around so the microphone can get to you.
There was a poll released just today that showed people still believe Labour are most trustworthy to run the NHS and make their own families better off, but only 12% actually trust Miliband to run the country, and even less trust him to speak the truth. Do you think there's any chance Miliband could recover just so close to the election?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a case of actually recovering. I can't see how you can do anything about those kinds of numbers in this amount of time. I think, however, when you look at the detailed polling and compare Cameron to Miliband, Miliband has got one thing over David Cameron, and that is being slightly more in touch with the concerns of ordinary people. Yes, the on your side question. Yeah. That actually is quite an important trait for an opposition leader. There is some pointy-headed political science research to say that when voters are looking at two leaders, they judge the opposition leader on slightly different criteria to the criteria on which they judge the sitting Prime Minister. And actually, the guy being on your side or being in touch is quite important, which is why I think, and there are many reasons for this, but why I think Miliband was so desperate to have those debates, actually, because that would have allowed him to emphasise that. And there's also the fact that actually Ed Miliband's quite good in that particular forum.
I mean, you're quite right. They have been desperate to have them, and for the opposite reason, the Conservatives have been desperate not to have them, because we would see whether this is true or not, but Ed Miliband and his people did think if he had some prolonged exposure to the electorate and came on stage and didn't trip over his shoelaces, that would be one big opportunity, really the only big opportunity he's got to get people to reassess him as a candidate?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something in that, in the sense that expectations of Ed Miliband are so low, and the impressions the public have of him are so poor that they almost couldn't be borne out in reality in the TV studio. Yeah. And actually, most people, we have to remember, pay so little attention to politics that if they're asked to give a judgment about Ed Miliband, it simply will be the common wisdom. And perhaps it is possible that once people begin to sort of tune into politics a little bit more, which they do in an election campaign, something could begin to shift, but it won't be massive.
I'm going to ask you, put you on a spot, Tim, and ask you a personal question. Based on your book, because Conservatives say, basically, he's just not up to it. He's not up to being Prime Minister. Do you think he's up to being Prime Minister?
Well, he's got something going for him in the sense that he's experienced. So, I mean, he's been a cabinet minister. He knows how the thing works. And actually, they're doing quite a lot of preparation in terms of the process. I think that's possibly true. I think he's got something else going for him, that she is a reasonably good manager of relationships and people, which would help him in coalition negotiations and might help him if he's in a minority government situation, because there's a lot of negotiation going on in there. The problem that people say he has, and you'll hear this all the time, and no doubt you'll hear it all the time, which is he couldn't make a decision to save his life. This isn't a person who is decisive. I think there must be a grain of truth in that, because so many people say it, and that would be a concern. On the other hand, those people who have worked with him, when you put that complaint to them, say that one of the reasons that colleagues and civil servants say that about him is actually this is someone who is prepared to kind of question the figures he's given, prepared to question the options he's given, and prepared to sometimes sort of think outside the box. And actually what they're complaining about is the fact that he doesn't simply choose one of the options that he's offered by them. And that's what they're so furious about. Now, I think actually, to be honest, I don't think he'd make any worse a fist of the job than most of those, I know it's not a huge endorsement, who've done the job.
Where are we setting the bar?
Well, I mean, let's be frank about this. There aren't that many people who have made a complete Horlicks of being Prime Minister. I mean, Anthony Eden, Ted Heath probably, and Gordon Brown. Yeah. Apart from those three, I mean, actually, if you look at all the post-war prime ministers, not that many of them have made a complete mess of it.
No, and of course the machine takes you by the hand. There's Jeremy Hayward, welcome to Downing Street. Yeah. I mean, if the Labour Party, the big if, could get him over the line, I suspect, I mean, always the conundrum with this is the best way to look prime ministerial is be Prime Minister. Yeah. And until you are there doing that next to Barack Obama, you do suffer a bit. So if he could get over the line, he'd probably get some points.
Yes.
Because he'd turn up maybe with Angela Merkel and he wouldn't be a total
embarrassment,
etc.
If you've got the comparison, with David Cameron. I mean, people say about David Cameron that he doesn't do detail, for example. I mean, I think he can do it if he wants to, but he just chooses not to do it most of the time for some reason. Let's say he's the essay crisis prime minister and that kind of thing. I mean, obviously Miliband, I don't think would be like that. I mean, Miliband can do the detail and can focus on things perhaps in a way that's superior to David Cameron, but he hasn't got clearly the kind of communicational abilities that Cameron has got. It'd be difficult to see, I think, Ed Miliband doing the kind of Bloody Sunday apology speech in the way that David Cameron did it, because David Cameron, on a big occasion, I think you'd say, kind of steps up. I mean, Miliband occasionally does, and we shouldn't forget that he's had his moments even in Parliament, even in Prime Minister's Question Time. He's had the odd flash of kind of inspiration and brilliance, but he's not a born communicator in that sense. However, if you've seen him in a situation like this, if you've ever seen Ed Miliband in a meeting like this in a Q&A, he's a lot better than I am. So he's got something. It's just whether it can translate to a kind of mass audience through the television in a way that it just hasn't been able to so far.
Okay. Let's have another question, please. Who's got a question? I don't like to... I can't see your face, but right at the back. I think you're wearing grey.
No, it's the lady there.
That lady there, yeah.
What would you advise Ed Miliband do about the immigration issue? And I wonder, how would you rate his handling of the issue so far?
Well, This is one, as you know, I should say hello, Rebecca. This is something that the Labour Party has really shifted on, actually, since 2010. I mean, I think one of the things that the Labour Party has been, and Ed Miliband has been quite open about, is the extent to which they got it wrong on immigration, at least as far as public opinion was concerned, and that they have made very big steps to move to a more kind of restrictive agenda on immigration. Now, whether you think that's right or not is another matter, but there's no doubt that Yvette Cooper, really since 2010 onwards, with Ed Miliband's complete agreement, has shifted the party towards what some people would call the centre, or towards public opinion, or what some people would call the kind of authoritarian, restrictive kind of right position on this. And that maybe has been, slightly reflected in the opinion polls, because the Conservatives' lead over Labour on immigration is actually much smaller than it used to be. That's partly, of course, because the Conservatives have come down and UKIP have gone up. But I think that's partly because one thing you can say about Yvette Cooper and Ed Miliband is they probably kind of at least staunched the bleeding on that one. And it was a really big issue. If you look at research on the 2010 election, where Labour got really hit, actually wasn't on the economy and public spending. It was on immigration and welfare. And welfare is the other one where they've had to try and do that.
Yeah, Liam Byrne did a very interesting study about their meltdown in what you might loosely call the Mrs. Duffy vote.
Yes,
That
absolutely.
election. Do we have another question, please? Thank you. That gent there, please.
I'm Ollie, I'm a criminal student. How on earth did Ed and his team do such a terrible job of basically allowing the Tories to paint Labour as responsible for the economic crash?
I mean, I think, one answer is clearly that they had a navel-gazing leadership contest over the months in which that narrative was being very strongly established. I think you also have to give some credit, to be honest, to George Osborne and to David Cameron for being incredibly effective and on message on that and hammering that home. Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, one thing you can say about George Osborne is once he's got the strategy, he will just go for it and go for it. And I think that whole idea of maxing out the nation's credit card, not fixing the roof while the sun was shining, those are quite kind of powerful metaphors, actually. They create pictures in people's heads, and they establish a narrative in the ways that most people can understand, in much the same way as Margaret Thatcher used household as a metaphor for the economy. And they've been very, very powerful. And I think it comes back to this problem of Labour not being quite sure, actually, about whether it did the right thing. Certainly, in the latter part of the new Labour years, in terms of the amount of spending, they were doing. There are some people in the Labour Party, I think, who aren't completely confident that they didn't spend too much and they weren't too lax, and they actually let things get out of control. So I think that concern on their part, I think, has made it more difficult for Labour to come back, because they haven't got a kind of solid message that they can sell back. And it comes back to this problem about the new Labour years, really. What do they defend, what do they not defend?
Another question? Yes.
What impact do you think Ed Miliband becoming Prime Minister could have on the current debates about the UK's membership of the EU and a potential referendum?
Well, one of the, I guess, impressive things about Ed Miliband, and this comes back to him changing or not, is that he made a decision, I think, fairly early on, that he wasn't going to be pushed into, matching the Conservatives' pledge for a referendum, rightly or wrongly, and he's stuck to that. There is going to be a problem, however, and we were talking about this actually with colleagues earlier on, that if Labour does get into government and it's a minority government, it will be facing presumably a Conservative Party that elects a much more Eurosceptic leader. It might be facing a parliament which includes Nigel Farage and a few more UKIP MPs. There will be overwhelming pressure, I think, to try and sort of deal with this issue. And there will be people in the Labour Party, who think it's time to have this argument, it's time to have it out, and actually we can't avoid this referendum, and that it will be better to concede it and to actually, move on it. On the other hand, there are lots of people in the Labour Party, personally, I think quite rightly, who say that, this is not the time for a referendum, that it will be destabilising for the economy, and that perhaps it will come, but it's best not done at the moment. I think on balance, the latter side will prevail, because I think the consequences of holding a referendum and losing are so huge, both for the country and Labour's kind of vision of how the country should be going forward, that they simply won't take that risk. But we do know there must be a referendum in this country sometime, and it will be an in-out referendum, because even Labour have promised that. Given the triple lock, given the fact that 5-10 years into the future there will be a new treaty that proposes some kind of transfer of powers, we will have to have a referendum, and it will be an in-out referendum. So it's coming down the line. It's just when the train comes, really.
Okay, Tim, I'm going to put you on the spot. May the 8th, will Ed Miliband be Prime Minister, or about to become Prime Minister, or will he join the sad roster of leaders of the opposition who never quite made it?
Well, I think...
Yes or no?
I'll answer this like a politician. I mean, I would say that if Ed Miliband does not become Prime Minister, he's not going to last as the leader of the Labour Party.
No,
I think that's
toast,
absolutely certain. That's absolutely certain. So I think
you only get one go these days.
I think we can park that one.
Yeah.
I think the question is what happens if you get a situation in which the Labour Party doesn't actually finish in front of the Conservative Party, but finishes a few seats trailing of the Conservative Party. I think Ed Miliband has still got a chance of becoming Prime Minister if that is the case.
He could make an argument it's all very unstable, and then Cameron fails to form a government.
Yeah, absolutely. And lots of people would argue that Labour, whether they like these options or not, has more options than the Conservative Party in terms of parties that will support a Labour government. So I think still it's entirely possible. I think one thing that we have to look at, though, is what happens to UKIP, actually, between now and May the 7th. Because if UKIP, begins seriously to lose support in the way that I think the Greens will probably lose support, and much good for Labour, I think that could scupper Miliband's chances. I think if UKIP doesn't do the damage to the Conservative vote that most Labour people think it will do, then Labour's in trouble. But if UKIP, I think, polls anything near kind of 10%, I think that Labour is still in with a good chance. And therefore Ed Miliband is.
Well, that brings us nearly to the close of this part of the evening, but Tim will be available to sign copies of his excellent book afterwards, and there's free drink as well.
More importantly.
But for the moment, I'll just say thank you very much to Tim.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.